Assalamualaikum. Jazakallah for this refreshing original presentation on this topic. I just wanted to ask, why do you think there are so few non-Uyghur sisters who are active, and visible on the kind of diversity, who are especially, non-Uyghur? And I mean, just to kind of make a point, looking at the back of the discovery, the back of this event, all three of the Muslim speakers who are invited to events are Uyghurs. There's no sort of evidence, or there are very few sort of non-Uyghur Muslim sisters who people are actively aware of that are well known for this species or for their kind of knowledge of Islam. So, just your thoughts on that and sort of how we can tackle this, because you can understand the situation in a Muslim country on this prejudice and this cultural issues and stuff, but living in a Western country, you'd expect the situation to be a bit different.
You'd expect it to be different, yeah.
Is it okay if I ask 2 questions?
You could ask one and then afterwards, if there's time, you can ask another.
Thank you very much indeed for the valuable information that you have given to us. My question, from your experience, what are the benefits that you have got when you converted to Islam and you were not able to have it before when you were not Muslim? Thank you very much.
Take 3 at a time, yeah?
Is that okay?
Yeah, 3 at a time's good, no more.
Yeah, my question sort of got 2 parts to it. But it is one question.
There's one question, yeah?
I
To be fair.
really appreciate all the stuff you said about, liberating women and how they shouldn't have a duty to do, specific things, under any religion. But my query was, do you feel that, wearing the headscarf is an implementation by men or a duty by God, and also if it is a duty by man or God, do you feel that having a duty to wear something is free?
Oh, thank you. The first question was about the lack of sisters, and I suppose specifically non-revert sisters on the scene. In my experience, to be able to be a public speaker, you have to have been given a certain level of self-confidence through the support of your family and your peers. And you need to not conceive of yourself as somehow lacking. And I'm not sure that the way that we educate our young women is very empowering, in the sense that I'm not entirely sure that it always convinces them that they are equal to men and that they have the right, just like men, to come out and talk about Islam and express views and opinions, and that they don't have to be reliant on a man in order to express those views. I would ask, for example, any of you who've got sisters to think about the way or the differences perhaps between how you were raised and your sister was raised. Of course there are exceptions, but I think in a lot of cases a lot of the things that build confidence in young people, including really basic things like sports. Sports achievements in sports and extracurricular activities are a way of building self-esteem, self-confidence, autonomy, and for some reason we often see that a lot of young Muslim women are held back from these activities. I think that's partly to obviously, as a revert, I didn't really have that complex, alhamdulillah, and I certainly didn't find that in Islam when I converted, to conceive of it like that. Of course, meeting the community was a different affair, but you know, the text itself, I didn't find that to be true, and I think perhaps that might explain partly. The benefits of being a revert. Well, of course, I remember Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad actually describing what it's like to convert, and he said it was a little bit like when somebody had described the moon to you, and then suddenly you see it. Like, how could anybody possibly understand what the moon really looks like until they've seen it for themselves? It's kind of like a bright sphere with kind of chunks, you know. When you see it, subhanAllah, the moon, it's amazing, you know. And I suppose realizing that there is a spiritual side to yourself is possibly the most fulfilling thing that you could ever discover about yourself. Realizing that there is a form of nourishment, spiritual nourishment, that you hadn't accessed prior to that. Of course, that's hugely rewarding. And I think, you know, I grew up in a very, I think like a lot of young women, a lot of pressure to compete with men in all spheres, including in the workplace, for example, so that I felt the need to keep up with the achievements of my male peers in terms of job success and that sort of thing. And I do think that in that sense, a lot of women who perhaps don't have the insight from the Islamic perspective of the reward that you get from choosing to look after a family at any point in time, whether it be for, you know, a small amount of time or an extended period, feel very guilty about taking that time out. There's a lot of pressure on women not to take time for family. Certainly I know friends of mine who have had to hide pregnancies from their workmates so that they would get a promotion, you know, because they want to be considered alongside their male peers, but if they're pregnant, this works against them. So, of course, suddenly an aspect of your femininity which you are entitled to, and you shouldn't just be entitled to, you're doing a service to humanity, you're reproducing the human race, you have a right to be recognized for that. And yet, you know, we're penalized for it. You know, women who take, instead of taking the 6 months, which they should, you know, take 2 years with their first child or second child or whatever, then come back to work and there's a lot of hostility, you've let the team down. You know, I think from the Islamic perspective, the idea that there is huge fulfillment to be found in those roles and it's not something to be demeaned is something very refreshing. On the issue of the headscarf, how did I know this one would come up? The headscarf, is it for men or is it for God? It's obviously for God. You wear it for God. And I definitely reject the idea that the concept of modesty, which the headscarf is only one small part of, I do like to point that out, because people tend to make a whole religion out of the headscarf, when actually the idea is to dress modestly, and then there are certain criteria for that. But the concept of modesty applies both to men and women. It's not an exclusively female affair. And though there may be difference in the manifestation of that modesty, there are equal or exactly the same requirements in terms of how one behaves. So we have to lower our gaze, we have to dress modestly, we have to effectively have a certain level of decorum in our interaction. But I certainly do not wear the headscarf because I think that men can't control themselves, which is a cliche that one hears very regularly. Rather, I think that there is a very natural tendency to focus on the outer rather than on the inner, and that the concept of modesty is a means of blocking that in certain situations. So that is to say, there is a very perfectly natural and healthy outlet for those, for that instinct, if you like, to appreciate the outer. But certainly in the public sphere, that's not what we hope the primary focus would be on. And now, of course, the question that always comes, and presumably would be your second part of your question, would be, well, why do women have to wear the headscarf and men don't? Because a lot of people like to ask that one. And I usually answer that one by saying, I don't know if you've ever read a women's magazine, maybe Vogue or any other. I'm sure you have. Come on, once or twice in the doctor's surgery, yeah? And how many or what percentage of the images in a women's magazine would you suggest were of women? Now, I've actually done statistical analysis of this, so I can tell you that it happens to be over 95%, sometimes far more than that. Women like looking at women. Now, what percentage of men do you think there are in men's magazines? Yeah? Statistically irrelevant is the answer. Less than 1%. Yeah? So the clever people who make an awful lot of money out of exploiting what seems to be a natural tendency for both men and women to prefer looking at women seem to understand something which a lot of other people don't seem to want to understand or pretend they don't understand, which is that women are beautiful, and this can become a slightly obsessive focus on beauty if our entire society premises female success on living up to that ideal. And so, as women, we can say, actually, we choose to limit that aspect by dressing modestly, and of course the headscarf is just one aspect of that. You know, you can of course be modest without a headscarf, not saying you can't. This is just, if you like, it's the cherry on the cake. You still have a cake if you don't have a cherry, but you don't have a cake if you just have a cherry. Yeah? Think about it. Sorry.
We'll take 3 more questions from the floor. Please raise your hand. Any more questions? Raise your hand. Okay, we'll have that lady there. That guy there, and that guy there.
Yeah, it's fine, yeah. It's my favourite part.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, I've still done this so much. Thank you.
You said this is a man and woman situation, like we both have to deal with the situation together to resolve. Like in the UK, freedom of speech is supposed to be more than in what at least perceived by me than in Islamic countries. But in my opinion, here I feel that I have to be careful with what I say, especially when referring to Islamic communities and other communities that are not myself. Like, for example, like once I stated that Asian people were really happy and content and such a good aura around them, and I was perceived as being racist. I don't know how, and I was actually complimenting them. So I think that why don't developed countries educate people about different cultures and religions to avoid misunderstanding between them, which I think is a huge gap. And because education is obviously the tool for so many solutions. And it also would educate women in their rights, and men, and how they should view us in both ways, And yes, it would help us to do it in each manner. So I guess why don't they do that here?
Thank you.
Jazakallah, sister, for the enlightening talk. Today, in most of the anti-Muslim websites or propagandists cite this reason for women oppression. They say that in Islam, 2 women witnesses are equal to 1 woman witness. Could you just enlighten on this as well?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lovely talk. Just a quick question. You did mention that there was a particular sheikh that you mentioned who gave a talk at Oxford where you mentioned that it's not obligatory for women to do, household work.
Yes.
So was that his opinion, or is it part of the Quran and Sunnah that women should not or doesn't have to do household work?
not a surprise to me that it's a man asking me whether or not it's in the Quran that women have to cook and clean for them. Yes, no, of course. I'll take those in order. Islamic countries, freedom of speech, education, whoa, a whole load of things there. I think one of the terms that started to come about that people have stopped referring, if you like, to the notion of Islamic countries and preferred the term Muslim majority countries. The reason that is because we don't actually know how Islamic those countries are, and so the actions or the behavior of particular peoples in those countries can't necessarily be said to reflect what Islam says about any particular given issue. So, for example, on the issue of freedom of speech, I think it is absolutely impossible to understand the reaction of people in Muslim majority countries to things like the Danish cartoons without understanding history, which is to say the Europe historically and America recently have been seen as colonial imperialist powers, have been colonial and still are imperialist powers, which have imposed their will, be it territorial expansion or cultural expansion, on developing countries, which many or most Muslim majority countries are. And for that reason, the power imbalance means that I think, for very understandable reasons, Muslims are very sensitive to the way that the West deals with them. There's a big history there. There's a lot of, there's a lot predating the Danish cartoons. They didn't come in a vacuum, yeah? And so the other thing about freedom of speech is that the basic rules, I suppose, of politeness that usually occur in, I think, interactions with different communities have been abused when it comes to the Muslim community, which is to say that, of course, the paper has the right to publish those cartoons, but why would you want to offend, 1 in 4 of the world's population? I mean, why? Because this is, of course, attacking Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is attacking the central figure of, one of the main faiths in the world. And I think that's where the issue comes into it. I remember, is it Omid Jalili? Anybody know? Omid Jalili, the comedian? Yeah. Who said that he doesn't ever attack. He attacks religion. He attacks religious people in his comedy sketches, but he never attacks religious figures because he says they're so close to people's hearts that it just becomes offensive. And I suppose that's it. If you are already feeling victimized and then people then offend you, your offense becomes magnified by what's preceded it. I usually say it's a little bit like the woman who's been beaten for years and who one day, the man kind of gives her a little slap and she turns around and stabs him. It wasn't the slap, that made her stab him. There's a lot going on before that, and any court of law would take that into account. But obviously, not many people know much about the antecedents to things like the Danish cartoon. They just see kind of crazed Muslims burning figurines or whatever it is that they do. It's also good to point out that the Prophet, peace be upon him, suffered huge abuse during his lifetime and didn't respond in any way comparable to that. We have, for example, a story of a woman who used to take it upon herself to she would collect her garbage and keep it until she would see the Prophet passing underneath her window and pour it on him every time he passed. That was her favourite pastime. And of course, one day he walked by and she failed to pour the garbage. And he actually went to inquire about her and said, "Oh, she didn't pour the garbage on me today. I was just wondering if she was okay." That's how the Prophet did it. We go and burn flags. So, the behaviour is not quite consistent with the example that we are supposed to follow. You asked about education. I mean, I completely agree with you on education. I think it's a travesty that we don't teach in our school, in mainstream schools, about different religions and different philosophies. In fact, I think philosophy is a very important gateway into understanding theology, and I think it's a big gap. And if you want to campaign for some religious education in mainstream education, I'm with you. I think it would be a very important contribution to broadening people's horizons and effectively helping them to understand both their own rights and how other people conceive of their worldviews. Witnesses and financial transactions. Well, the Quran actually doesn't say that you need 2 female witnesses for all transactions or all procedures, because of course we know that in the case of divorce, the woman is exactly, she is a witness and the man's a witness, and that's it. The verse you're talking about actually refers specifically to financial transactions, if you like, transactions in the marketplace, which women weren't really very involved in. You've got to remember, at the time of Islam, not many people were literate, and not many women were literate, and very few women were engaged in those types of transactions. So what the verse actually says is, it starts off by saying, get a scribe, because these are such important transactions. They would be devised on one day and payment could occur years later. You couldn't afford to have a mix-up on these things. You'd have tribal war over this stuff. So it's very important to get that right. And so the beginning of it talks about scribes, the need to make sure these things are written down. And then it talks about the need for witnesses, and it says, if you fear forgetfulness, then bring 2 women. And what that's called is an illah in the text. There is a condition placed on the verse. That is, if you fear that they will be forgetful, then bring 2. But if you don't, because she's the head of HSBC, and Allah knows best. There's a huge debate on these issues within the Muslim community. I'm giving you one opinion here. There are many more, and I'm sure lots of people will come and discuss them with me after the talk. But of course, that's the truth about a lot of issues in Islam, is that we are discussing them. They're in movement. What you hear in the way people interpret it in Morocco differs from the way they understand it in Indonesia. So there's, a huge variety, despite what people like to think. So that would be my answer to that. Household work. Oh, Sheikh Akram. Well, I suppose the best thing to do, and what I think you really ought to do, is contact Sheikh Akram on this one. But of course, him being a scholar, his references are the Quran and Sunnah. He is traditionally trained. He's a member of the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies, so he's a very well-respected scholar. But of course, he is building on the Hanafi madhab, so he's using precedents within that school of thought to express that. But if you want examples from the life of the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, we know, of course, that he mended his own socks and helped in the home, and was always willing to help his wives. So I suppose there is very much evidence in the Sunnah to argue this. And it's not just in the Hanafi madhab, actually. In the Maliki madhab, for example, it's considered wajib for the man to provide a domestic help to the wife if she comes from, particularly if she comes from like a middle class background in which she didn't have those responsibilities in her own home. So the idea that, looking after a home and a family is a huge amount of work that requires help, because I think that's the important thing to remember here. In both of those things, there's a suggestion that this is a big responsibility, a big burden, and that it needs help, and whether you can afford to pay someone to do it or whether you should do it yourself, i.e. help, somebody's got to help, I think is the point. Yeah.
Okay, we're now going to take the last 3 questions for this evening. So if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand high up in the air. So. Okay, so we'll take the lady there, we'll take the gentleman there, and one more question. Yes, we'll take you so you can take your second question as no one else put their hand up. Okay.
It's just the little question that was in my mind is you said little mention for the honor killing. So I just want to ask, I was watching the television last week, so it was the news from Pakistan. It's like some areas they are doing the honor killing. So what was the woman, she just killed by an honor because somebody has killed her, the other person whose name was Ahmed, and instead of him, the other lady was killed by her. So I don't know, is in Quran, what did you say, like honor killing is a right? Is there is a law that we have to kill somebody, like if somebody killed his family member?
I think it is obvious. I mean, in these days, that there are a lot of, or many of the external effects that may drive Muslim in general and women Muslim in particular to a side which is made against Islam. So I would like to ask you kindly, what is your message or your advice for those, for our mothers and sisters and daughters who could face these effects?
I can pretty much relate my question to the question that my sister has just asked, that our behaviors, mostly it's seen that underdeveloped countries, that culture pretty much overshadows the true teaching of Islam, which amplifies the misconceptions. I want to ask us, what is the remedy? How can a clear picture can be portrayed that helps dissolve these misconceptions and perhaps give a much clearer view?
Thank you. Sister, so I think henceforth we shall refer to them as dishonourable killings, because there is nothing honourable about honour killings. The first thing that I have to point out is that Muslims are bound by the laws of the country in which they find themselves through the contract of citizenship. So if the law of your country, that's what you should be referring to in any incidents that occur, whether that's in Pakistan or in England. And it should never be what this is essentially rogue justice. Send your cousin out to do a hatchet job. That's what it really is. And that is not just unjust, it's completely contrary to the teachings of Islam. And the people who are engaged in that need to fear Allah, because I would not want to have to answer on Judgment Day for their actions. I would say that, of course, we do know that there are a number of punishments stipulated in the Quran, and one of them, very few in fact, but one of them is for murder. So purely from a shari'i, if you like, perspective, the right of the victim is for the perpetrator. They have the right to ask for the death penalty for the perpetrator of the killing. Yeah, not his cousin or his wife or his sister, but for the perpetrator. Okay, they have the right. But of course, in all of the Quranic verses that refer to punishments, it says you have that right, but it would be better if you forgave. Yeah, and of course, Muslims seem to always forget that forgiveness is always better in the sight of Allah. So whilst we have that right, whilst you can as a victim request it, it's always better to forgive. Yeah? And I would say that in any of these situations, you have to go to the courts and to the legal system of your country. This rogue justice has to stop. It's absolutely unacceptable. And the consequences, of course, women paying the highest price, as usual. And it's just out of order. And it's important to point out that there is nothing in Islam. Honor killings is not an Islamic phenomena. It's completely contrary to Islam. and it needs to stop. And I think Muslims need to be actively engaged in this stuff. This isn't a battle that we need to leave to other people. This is our fight, yeah. And it's something that we all need to be invested in to ensure that and usually young women have to pay this inordinate toll for these awful cultural practices. And yeah. Advice for women. I just wrote advice for women. Who asked me this one? So yes. What advice do I have for our sisters? Really, it's education all the way, you know. It's about making sure that you educate yourself about your rights and that you get a marriage contract. Yeah? Marriage contract, ladies, all of you, make sure you get a marriage contract and make sure you stipulate in your marriage contract what you want and what you don't, more specifically. I think it's very important that women realise that marriage contracts, you know, that's their right to have a marriage contract, and you are fully within your rights to stipulate all sorts of things within that contract. So it's very important that you are aware of your rights so that you know what you can do and what your rights effectively are. And that's something that I saw when I was living, for example, in the Middle East, is that I would talk to women who'd be complaining about something, and I'd say, well, but in Islam they're not allowed to do that. And she said, really? Oh, are you sure? He told me we are. Sorry to rock the boat. But yeah. Okay, sure, yeah. So in Islam, we don't view, of course, marriage is the joining together of these two souls. But we understand that by the virtue of human nature, things can get complicated, and we've got something called a marriage contract, in which you can make lots of stipulations. It's a little bit, I suppose, like a prenup. Yeah, it's, I suppose, a Muslim version of a prenup, in which you can stipulate all sorts of things, including standards of living, you know, what you expect from your husband, you know, and you can specifically put things in there, such as, you know, I don't want him to remarry. Yeah, he can't have any more wives. Yeah, did you hear that, sisters? Yeah. Okay. So, of course, if you want him to have more wives, then you don't tick that box. Yeah. So I'll come back to you if that's like. Oh, is it? It's about this one, is it? Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Isn't it true that a man isn't allowed to remarry without the permission of his first wife, whether it be in the contract or not?
In the Hanbali school of thought, you're absolutely correct, yeah. As far as I'm aware, it's just in the Hanbali school, but I would have to consult somebody more knowledgeable, and Allah knows best. But I know that definitely in the Hanbali school, yeah. Yeah.
She can ask that he is willingly, if he's going to marry again,
yeah,
that he will divorce her straight away, without even going to the court or do anything, just straight away. I want to be divorced.
Yeah.
So he can give her all her,
her dowry.
Yeah, dowry
Yeah.
and everything.
Yeah. Well, this is why it's so important to get these things down in a contract, really, because the messiness of human affairs is such that, the other way, that of course we want all of those things clarified prior to that point. How to remedy these misconceptions? Well, I suppose the best way is that, we have to remember why have we got revelation? Revelation is supposed to be a message, a guidance, a body of ethics, which is there to improve the nature of our societies, to render them more ethical, more just, more fair. Yeah? And if our societies don't live up to those ethical ideals, then the best way to remedy any misconceptions is to start implementing the ethical ideals of the faith in not only our personal life, but of course in the world around us. So I mean, I always say it all starts at home, really. You start by being the best husband you can be, and the best father you can be, and then the best member of your family, the best member of your community. And it should really move from there on out. But ideally, it's about bringing our behavior in line with our ethics. At the moment, we have this discourse about Islam, and it's so great, and it says all this stuff, and our behavior is all the way over there and completely disconnected from it. And Islam is not a badge of honor. It's, you know, it's something which is supposed to be manifest in our actions. You know, I think it's sad that we've almost relegated it to decorative signs on our walls, or, you know, the Quran hanging from our car, you know, what is it, mirror. You know, it's almost become ornamental. And I remember one sheikh saying once, some people make religion into fun and fun into a religion. And unfortunately, we as Muslims haven't escaped that. You know, it's like religion should be taken seriously. It's a form of guidance, supposed to be something which helps us to become better human beings and create a more balanced, harmonious world. If the world isn't in that state, then we've got a lot of work to do. Effectively, we have a lot of work to do, yeah. Inshallah.